Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unraveling a genuine historical detective mystery. We're going to take a look at one of the most recognizable symbols in the entire world and trace its roots back 3 centuries to a story so improbable it literally defies belief. Seriously, get ready to completely rethink what you thought you knew about history. So, let me ask you, whose story actually put the black scar on Ghana's flag? Think about it. Millions of us see this bold central symbol every single day. It's flying in front of government buildings, it's stitched onto national football kits, it represents an entire nation. But do you actually know its true 300-year-old origin? Okay, let's dive into this, because we have to immediately dispel some really common myths here. If you ask most people where the Black Star comes from, they're probably going to say Ghana's first president Kwame Nkrumah came up with it. Or maybe they'll point to the Jamaican Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey and his famous Black Star line. But honestly, neither of them originated this concept. No way. They were actually pointing backward in time to honor someone else entirely. The real story doesn't begin with 20th century politicians. It begins way back here with a 4-year-old boy. He was born around 1703 into the Nzema people in Okiana. That's a small village near Axim in the western region of present-day Ghana. Now, his birth name is actually lost to history, but the name he was given, Anton Wilhelm Amo, well, that name would go on to literally shake the foundations of European academia. But Amo's journey begins with one of the absolute most brutal institutions in human history. In 1707, at just 4 years old, he's taken from Axim, most likely by the Dutch West India Company. He's shipped off to Amsterdam, treated as mere property, and given as a quote-unquote gift to Anthony Ulrich, the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel over in Germany. It's a harsh, horrific 18th century reality, and honestly, mathematically speaking, this absolutely should have been the end of his story. But what happens next is just extraordinary. Instead of exploiting him as a servant or a slave, the Duke recognizes something deeply special in this kid. He actually adopts Amo into his own royal household. Just think about that. Suddenly, this child taken from a Ghanaian fishing village is being nurtured, educated, and baptized in the exact same palace rooms frequented by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the most legendary mathematicians and philosophers of the age. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of his brilliance. As Amo grew, he progressed through these elite preparatory schools and entered the university system. And during his studies, he didn't just learn a new language. He mastered 6 languages simultaneously. We're talking English, French, Dutch, Latin, Greek, and German, all at once. And he definitely didn't stop at languages. His mastery spanned a truly staggering breadth of subjects. Get ready for this list: logic, metaphysics, physiology, astronomy, history, law, theology, politics, medicine. Amo possessed an absolute intellectual dominance that would challenge any top-tier scholar today, let alone a man operating in an era that broadly and wrongly believed Africans were incapable of such thought. His academic rise was just unbelievable. Let's trace it out. In 1727, he formally matriculates at the University of Halle. He's the first African ever to do so. By 1730, he earns his Magister's degree at the prestigious University of Wittenberg, even leading their formal academic parade. Fast forward to 1736, he is officially a lecturer back at Halle, and by 1739, he's teaching at the University of Jena. Anton Wilhelm Amo became the very first African to study, receive a PhD from, and teach at European universities, a real game changer. But, Amo wasn't just quietly blending into the background. Far from it. In 1729, he presented his first major dissertation, titled On the Rights of Moors in Europe. This takes profound, unbelievable courage. A man who arrived as a captive gift chose to use his very first academic platform to construct a rock-solid legal argument defending the rights of Black people in Europe. He was writing about himself and everyone who looked like him. And then, in 1734, he reaches his philosophical peak with his doctoral dissertation. Amo didn't just study Western philosophy. He took on the heavyweights. He engaged directly with René Descartes, who is arguably the most important philosopher of the modern era. Amo offered this brilliant critique of Descartes' famous mind-body distinction, basically arguing that the mind is purely spiritual and doesn't experience sensation, only the living body does. Let me be clear, he wasn't just repeating Descartes, he was confidently correcting him. Okay, let's slow down here for a second, because this right here is where the history we think we know changes forever. In the highly competitive, incredibly rigorous corridors of 18th century German academia, Amo's absolute brilliance earned him a specific, highly revered nickname, der Schwarze Stern. Translated, it means the Black Star. And this wasn't a pejorative, not at all. It was a title of immense intellectual respect. It was a clear recognition that in this vast constellation of great European thinkers, this African man shone incredibly brightly. So this nickname didn't just stay isolated in Germany, it echoed across centuries. This is how the dots connect. Marcus Garvey learned of this legendary African intellectual and drew direct inspiration from Amo's title, the Black Star, to name his famous shipping company the Black Star Line, which called Black people back to Africa. Decades later, Ghana's future first president, Kwame Nkrumah, discovers that this legendary Black Star philosopher was actually a Ghanaian from right near his own hometown. Which brings us right to 1957, when the brilliant Theodosia Oko designed the new independent nation's flag. Nkrumah was absolutely adamant. He insisted that a black star be placed dead center. It wasn't just some generic symbol. It was a deliberate, direct tribute to Anton Wilhelm Amo. He was bringing the legacy of the first modern African intellectual giant right back home where it belonged. But sadly, Amo's life was not a simple fairy tale. The era of Enlightenment curiosity that had initially welcomed him began to drastically change. By the 1740s, German society really started to shift into this rigid, xenophobic, and racially hostile atmosphere. The very country that had elevated him slowly began pushing him out. And this hostility took very real, deeply painful forms. Amo was subjected to a deliberate public theater lampoon, designed to maliciously mock and humiliate him. Then, in 1743, a massive blow. His great champion and patron, Professor von Ludwig, died. Without his patron, Amo's institutional protection rapidly eroded. It became painfully, tragically clear that Europe, despite the incredible heights he had reached, was a place where a black philosopher could never truly be allowed to belong. Realizing his time in Europe was over, Amo made a monumental decision in 1747 to return home to the Gold Coast. But there is a really dark, agonizing twist of irony here. To get home, he actually had to board a ship owned by the Dutch West India Company. Think about that. That's the exact same company that had likely kidnapped and trafficked him as a 4-year-old child 40 years prior. I really want to let the crushing reality of this return sink in for a moment. He finally reunites with his father and sister in Axim, but you have to remember, Ghana at the time has no universities, no academic institutions. The man who had debated Cartesian philosophy at the absolute pinnacle of European academia was forced to sit at a workbench in Axim, surviving as a goldsmith. It's just devastating. And from there, one of history's greatest minds simply vanishes from the intellectual record. He returns in 1747. The last confirmed sighting of him is in 1753 by a Dutch ship's doctor near Axim, and historical consensus points to his probable death between 1756 and 1759 at Fort Shama on the Ghanaian coast. But his final days carry a really tragic possibility. Historical accounts actually suggest he may have been taken to Fort San Sebastian in Shama by Dutch authorities. Why? Well, because a brilliant, highly educated African man who had famously argued for the rights of black people was viewed as a major threat. He was likely isolated and potentially imprisoned right in his own homeland, all to prevent him from, quote, sowing dissent against colonial powers. So the crucial point is this: the world that ignored him for 3 centuries is finally attempting to give him his flowers. A statue is erected in Halle in 1965, the annual Amo Lectures began in Germany in 2013, and in 2020, Oxford University Press published a critical edition of his dissertations. They are firmly planting him right back into the formal Western philosophical canon, where he has always belonged. In fact, if you visit the University of Halle-Wittenberg today, you'll find a plaque that formally cements his reclaimed title. It proudly reads, "To the memory of Anton Wilhelm Amo from Axim in Ghana, the first African student and instructor of the Universities of Halle-Wittenberg in Jena, 1727 to 1747. Which leaves us with this final, lingering question. If a man who mastered 6 languages, corrected Descartes, and literally inspired an entire nation's flag was almost completely forgotten by history, how many other intellectual giants has history erased? Really think about that. But at least now, the next time you see the Black Star flying proudly on Ghana's flag, you'll know exactly who it belongs to. Say his name, Anton Wilhelm Amo. Thanks for exploring this amazing story with me, and